Here to cover all things crime, history, and politics, we're at the desk. I'm your host, Danny Vitale, and in today's episode, we'll be talking about action in the Middle East, a fun historical debate on pieces of media, the infamous crime boss Al Capone, and a short segment about the history of the Titanic. Now, come take a seat with us at the desk. Welcome back to ATD. First, we will be sending it over to our politics panel to discuss Iranian missiles and Representative Mike Johnson. Over to you, Yaya.
Thanks, Danny. Tonight, we dive into the weakening GOP majority in the House and how a storm may hit Congress this November with all seats up for election. Can Representative Mike Johnson retain his position as House Speaker and outlast his short-lived predecessor, Kevin McCarthy? Has the 118th United States Congress done enough for the American people? Critics are saying that it's the least productive in decades, as after coming to the House floor almost 750 times, only 27 bills have made it to the president's desk. But first, action in the Middle East as an Iranian attack on Israel included 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 110 ballistic missiles, which were shot down in the air, all of which a small number hit Israeli territory. Our panel is here to discuss. Jackson, let's start with you. No casualties reported. However, a Western military base was hit, severely injuring a child. With everything going on right now, what do you think President Biden and the U.S. reactions to this matter?
Well, first of all, 99% of the missiles were taken down in large part due to American forces, so that's why there were no casualties reported thus far. But this was clearly a response to the attack that Israel had against Syria a couple weeks ago. And yes, it's kind of this divide you're seeing in the Middle East between the Jews, Muslims, and it's kind of a response to what's been going on between Palestine and Israel. So I think that the U.S. response is going to vary depending on, of course, what we're going to talk about later with Mike Johnson and how much we want to invest in the Middle East and that war in general.
Yeah, and kind of like you were saying, about a month ago, that airstrike on the consulate in Syria killed 7 of their military officials, and so even though it's obviously not confirmed...
And 2 generals from...
Yes, yeah, and even though it wasn't confirmed, everyone's speculating that this was in retaliation towards that, but what you can really hope for here is, since there was no major casualties, major injuries or anything like that, maybe this will be a chance for them to de-escalate the situation, and hopefully instead of it continuing the way it's been going with more and more casualties, more and more problems as we've been seeing recently.
Right. But Israel has responded saying that they do have plans to retaliate. And we can see all these conflicts are kind of interconnected because this is actually the first time that Iran has overtly attacked Israel. They've been using proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, which we've seen has also been in conflict with the Israeli army. And, they've been backing some terrorist groups as well. And for this to be the first overt sign of aggression from Iran, missiles directly coming from Iranian soil and landing into or almost landing in Israel.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because, where
do we think this is going?
Yeah, so Iran has shown a lot of aggression over the years, obviously. It's been since the revolution. And it's obviously, a heavily Muslim country, and there is that religious divide within the Middle East. But yeah, this is the first time ever they've had a direct attack against Israel. And so it's going to be very interesting seeing not how the U.S. responds, but how Israel responds. Because as we know, they don't back down without a fight. And they will fight for their country and for their religion and for their nationality in general.
And that's definitely part of the hard part here is because, like you were saying, they're going to fight for what they believe in, and both sides are going to continue to do that. But can we find a way, hopefully they can find a way, to instead of it being fights that are going to have casualties and that are going to hurt civilians, more diplomatic ways to address these situations, which, who knows, because this has been going on for how long, and we're still seeing this back and forth war and nothing changing, but it's what's it going to take for maybe to step away from the violence and step towards more political, domestic solutions?
It's really, I have a hard time seeing it just because of how violent things have been, especially since the Hamas attack in October, and how many, you're seeing, 34,000 deaths, in the Gaza Strip right now. You're seeing all these just violence, death, everything else. So, I'm having a hard time seeing a diplomatic solution coming soon.
Well, but you have,
No, you're fine. I was just going to say that I know the U.S. is trying to play the role of peacemaker or in the process of trying to find some diplomatic ways. But just because of the U.S.'s relationship with Israel and then the U.S.'s relationship with other Middle Eastern countries, I'm just wondering how that's going to work, if the U.S. is going to have a foothold in this conversation, because we know that a lot of funding from the U.S. goes into Israel for them to fund their military and to fund their military, what they call them, devices.
Their means of military use.
yes.
Their military
Yes.
force. Let's say that. I don't know what the word would be.
It would be their equipment, the soldiers,
There you
food
go.
for the soldiers, everything
Exactly.
else. Everything that goes
Yeah.
into a military.
A lot of-
and that's been something that a lot of Americans have felt very strongly about. You're saying Biden is
and
funding
not
a
just
genocide.
Americans, but people in the Middle East as well have been saying that America is complicit in this kind of conflict because they're funding Israel. So I'm wondering if Iran would even be available or willing to sit down with
Right.
Israel and the U.S. for diplomatic relations.
And I mean, that's part of the problem because it's such a tricky relationships here and there and situations. It's hard to come to a place of let's come together and let's have a talk. And, you know, you'd have to hope with how we were saying about those casualties, eventually you would have to hope that number gets high enough that, well, not hope that number gets high enough, but hope that eventually they look at it and say, what are we doing here? We need to stop. We need to save our civilians, and we need to put on our big boy pants and have a conversation. And the U.S. has been trying to step in and trying to, like you were saying, start having those conversations. But also, like you were saying, it's hard to see that solution come to fruition unless something changes.
Yeah, and the U.S. has a history of stepping in when other countries are going through conflict, and we see this history repeating itself with our good friend Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, and how he has actually been in hot water with his own party for wanting to push an aid package to Ukraine, to Israel for their defense funds as well. And we see that a faction of the GOP has not been happy with him because of that. So, Jordan, I'm going to turn it to you. What do you think about, let's talk about Mike Johnson in general, his aid package, his plans, and how that's affecting his standing in the GOP.
I mean, Congress just seems to be a bit of a mess right now. So, you know, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy was ousted. Mike Johnson stepped in back in October, and it hasn't been a super long time in this position, and now they're calling for him to be removed as well. They're calling for him to resign. Respect to him for saying, no, I'm not going to resign. I believe in what I'm doing, and he's trying to push this aid package through, which interestingly he said he's trying to do in 4 parts in order to try to make it more likely for it to pass. But as you were saying, the GOP, some of the GOP members are heavily against it, and it's part of the reason they're calling for him to step down. So he's really going to have to rely on Democratic support to get this aid package pushed through.
It's so crazy because, you know, Mike Johnson is not even close to being moderate, and he is now relying on Democratic help to stay in his position. And it's really weird because we're kind of coming to a question of what is, you know, being a conservative. Because is it, you know, having the high military, because obviously a conservative policy is typically to have a lot of military force, you know, invest a lot of money in that, be the worldwide police, everything else. Or is it to be nationalistic and, you know, keep us safe, keep our military safe, and not get involved in these foreign affairs that we don't really have that much blood in as of right now? So that's what the question really comes down to. So is the far right going to win or the far right going to win? Because the regular right doesn't seem to be a thing right now. It seems to me like since Trump has come along, everything has become just so polarized, even with Democrats too. Everything has become so widespread and so divided, and that's why Congress has been so unproductive so far.
Right, and I'm wondering if Trump's comment, I believe last month or 2 months earlier, about encouraging Russia to be more aggressive to NATO allies that aren't paying their dues, I'm wondering if that's also kind of fueling what Jackson has so aptly named the far right in refusing to send aid to Ukraine, because obviously one thing that I always talk about is government spending and how that's such a huge issue, and how the GOP is really not a fan of the government going into deficits because we're sending aid to foreign countries, or whether it be healthcare or anything like that. But I'm wondering if it's these comments or this desire to almost follow Trump in almost everything that he says that can also be kind of like playing under, because if Trump gets reelected, then we've seen that maybe he's not so open to the idea of sending aid to Ukraine. So I'm wondering if the far right is kind of trying to set that stage for him and letting him know, we agree with you, we're here if and when you get reelected.
And the part of that makes this so interesting is Johnson is a pretty far-right conservative. He has a lot of conservative views, such as, you know, pro-life, anti-LGBTQ, but so it's really interesting to see him fighting for this aid package, which is something that a lot of the GOP has been against, which it's confusing to me, the Speaker of the House, who he is, because he has certain leanings, then he leans other ways, and it's just a very interesting situation, to say the least.
I feel like these days it's very hard to stick in one ideology almost.
It's truly, it's truly the great paradox of American politics, because you have two sides. You have the Democrats and Republicans, but there's so many, weird, because Republicans typically want less government involvement.
Yeah.
But then this would involve more government involvement because you're putting your government into another country.
And
so it's a very strange kind of paradox you see.
And part of me wonders is, because now that he is in this role as Speaker of the House, is he realizing that you gotta play the game. You gotta find a way to appease everybody, which is always gonna be hard to do. But I'm wondering if maybe that's also part of this, is like he is starting to broaden his horizon and look at issues a little bit differently, because you gotta try to make everybody happy, which maybe that's playing a role into his push for this aid package.
Yeah, but I'm also wondering just about the people who are so opposed to him being Speaker of the House, because it kind of seems like they're not happy with any choice.
Yeah.
We saw Kevin McCarthy was ousted after not even a year in his position, and now we have, after so many rounds of voting for a new Speaker of the House, we finally settled on Mike Johnson, and there's a whole new revolt that's happening. I've been seeing the AP describe it as a revolt from the farthest reaches of the GOP. So I'm wondering, like, who would they want to be Speaker of the House? Because if it continues like this, with all seats being up for re-election, then like the voters won't have anybody to choose from that like they can really identify themselves with, because everything is so fragmented.
And I think this really speaks to the polarization that we're seeing right now in the government and Congress, just in politics in general, kind of like how you guys both mentioned. We're in unprecedented times. We're seeing lots of divide in the country, and realistically, we need our Congress to kind of take the bull by the horns and try to find ways to mend, try to find ways to come to compromises with people they might not agree with, find ways to keep moving forward. I mean, even just a couple of weeks ago, we were facing a potential government shutdown because issues aren't getting through and no one's finding a compromise, which is in and of itself a whole other problem.
Yes, and I think that with the whole Speaker of the House question, I think that it comes down to this. A lot of these far right people only want Trump as president, or aren't even thinking about Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
They want their leader who they think was ideal back, of course, this November, and that's all they can really think about, especially Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, she's all about Trump, and she doesn't like these other Republicans. And she's gotten used to that, and obviously now we have a Democratic president, and not all of the government is Democratic, and obviously the House has started to become more and more leaning that way because the Republicans are so divided. So I don't really know who would be the number one contender for the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, but it's hard. I like what you said about how Republicans are seemingly only thinking about who's going to be president, not really thinking about securing the rest of the government, because we have to remember that we don't live in an autocratic country. Power is not just concentrated at the Oval Office. We have other branches that need to be taken care of, that need to be working smoothly for this well-oiled machine that we call government to run as it's supposed to. I mean, like, less than 30% of bills of, like, what was I trying to say? Congress has met 750 times and has not even gotten like 50 bills passed, which is insane. And things need to be getting done. And Congress is the heart of legislation in our country. So if they're only focused on what's happening in the White House, then Congress is going to fall apart, or the GOP's worst nightmare is going to be taken over by the Democrats. So I think they really need to get their act together.
And what if the GOP loses the control of the House and then Trump wins the election? Then what happens?
Right.
Then you have a conflict between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and then you have more lack of productivity.
Especially because the Senate is mostly Democratic-led right now. So you lose Congress, again, we're going to see another issue of Republicans in power, Democrats in power, and things aren't getting through. We've already been having an unproductive Congress so far. We need to find ways to mend that, not to continue that divide. But with the way things are going, it seems like that divide might continue, and it might still be a problem that we're going to face.
Of course, in an ideal world, you would hope that voters would, elect Republicans and Democrats who are more moderate and willing to talk to the other side and come to solutions for the good of the people and for the good of not just America but also for the world. But people are kind of sticking to who their prior loyalties, especially the people who are very far to the extreme sides, and it's just we're stuck in a loophole here where nobody wants to bend to the other side. And that's just causing this, just like this
more tension.
stale. Just nothing.
A big stalemate.
Yeah, stalemate, yes.
Exactly. And even just kind of going back to Mike Johnson, him as Speaker of the House surprised me because in the grand scheme of Congress and how long people are in there, he's a baby technically in that sense. He hasn't been in there for all that long. You know, we've seen congressmen be there for years and years. I mean, he's, 9 years, I think it was? He's only been involved in politics and was a lawyer before that. So, I mean, it flows in, and having that law experience is going to help him in politics. But still, it was a surprising choice, I think, just knowing that he still has a lot to learn and I think a lot of ground to make up in comparison to some of his counterparts.
Well, he just went to visit former President Trump to try and hash things out. I think I read a headline saying trying to gain his blessing. So hopefully that will increase his favorability with his fellow politicians in the GOP. That's all the time we have for tonight. This November, make sure to not just vote for president, but remember to vote for your local representatives, including your district representative in Congress. Back to you, Danny.
Thanks, Yaya. Stay tuned for our history panel for another thrilling debate all about media. We'll be right back at the desk. We are back at the desk. Now it's time for the history panel as they debate over different pieces of media. Over to you, Audrey.
Thanks, Danny. It's no secret that literature and media has had a colossal impact on our ways of life, and that narrative works can fuel movements and move mountains. For example, the shark hysteria that Spielberg's Jaws inspired, or the ammunition and the confidence the feminine mystique contributed to the second wave of feminism. So today, the history panel will be debating what piece of media had and maybe continues to have the most influence on American society. Like previous history panel debates, panelists will face off 1v1, winner v winner, and I will decide the ultimate victor based on their arguments right here, right now. So, to start off, we got Yaya 1, Drew Comer. Come on out, guys.
Nice to see you again,
Good
guys.
to see you. The two finalists from last debate. So.
Face off again.
Yes,
so
right away.
Shake on it.
Yep.
All right. Yaya, do you want to start? What are you
Yes.
championing today?
So, hello everybody. My name is Yaya. Today I'm going to be talking about The Jungle, a novel by Upton Sinclair published in 1906, which follows a fictionalized immigrant from Lithuania named Jurgis Rudkus and his attempt to achieve the American dream.
And Drew?
Today I will be covering the Washington Post release on the Watergate scandal that eventually got Richard Nixon kicked out of office.
All right. Yaya, would you like to start with your
All
argument?
right. So we have Jurgis Rudkus, a Lithuanian immigrant. He and his family immigrated from Lithuania, shocker. And he's trying to find work, and he goes into the meatpacking industry. He finds himself being overworked, at risk for injuries, and he sees his family dying left and right beside him. And originally, Sinclair's goal was to actually create economic change. He wanted America to shift to a more socialist society, but it actually had a different effect in the sense that they actually got two laws passed in 1906. The same year it was published, Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act. And you could arguably say that without this book describing the horrors of the meatpacking industry and how unsafe, unsanitary it is, we would be eating diseased meat to this day.
Yeah.
It definitely appalled Americans.
Totally. Absolutely. So the story with what happened with the Watergate with the Washington Post was two journalists with the last names of Woodward and Bernstein found out about the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, in which they found out through voice recordings of Richard Nixon himself that pretty much just incriminated himself. And the two took the story to the Washington Post. It was posted, right? And then they had a big backlash from the community, from American society, in which eventually Richard Nixon was kicked out of the presidency. And it changed forever the way that the American people view the presidency, because every single president that came after had some form of controversy, with Ford pardoning Nixon, with Carter and the hostages within Iran. And so eventually, this really changed the way that Americans see the presidency, but also the way that media deals with the presidency, because, you know, when you hear stuff like Pizzagate and Gamergate, all of these controversies that come up have the word gate following it because of the fact that Watergate was such a big moment in American history. Like, it really shattered our trust.
Right. Well, I do want to point out firstly that Richard Nixon actually was not officially kicked out of office. He resigned.
Yes.
First of all, because of the backlash that he was receiving from Watergate. And of course, Woodward and Bernstein, they're all inspirations to journalists everywhere. I mean, that's why you had such a big boom in journalism as a profession after Watergate. However, I do want to bring this back that at this point in time, I mean, impeachment is kind of a joke to us. I mean, I was just talking about politics.
To us now, certainly.
To us now, for sure.
Yeah.
But to bring it back to the jungle, I just think that it's very important to note that with the Pure Food and Drug Act that was passed in 1906, again, same year that this book was published, to create such a huge impact the year that your book is published is insane. This actually laid the foundations for the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA that we have today. And recently there was a whole outbreak with lead in cinnamon because the FDA was not doing its due diligence. But I believe that this book really set the precedent because it allowed people to think about, oh, hey, maybe we shouldn't be putting diseases and chemicals and stuff in our bodies. And before that, it was just something that we weren't aware of and something that people were not willing to think about. But because of this, now we're all very careful. As soon as the expiration on my yogurt hits, I'm throwing that thing away, tossed immediately. So I think that this really changed the way that people thought about their health, even if it wasn't Sinclair's intention. I mean, hopefully it led to a healthier America and workers' rights.
I do think that while our views of the presidency did change dramatically, it kind of has always been changing and evolving with every new president. So I think, and with the lasting of the FDA and that the impact that had, I think this is going to have to go to yay.
Excellent. There you go.
Nice one.
Good job.
Good job, guys.
All
All right, next we got Jake Santora. And we have, Brandon Cook, everyone.
Hello there.
All right, guys. Jake, what are you debating today?
I'm talking about 9/11, specifically the media coverage of 9/11, which, in my opinion, is just one of the most infamous productions of media that spanned across the U.S. You know, in a time of just such terror and grief. I think it's just such an important event that really altered the chemistry of how America sees terrorism and how America sees attacks on its own.
Brandon?
Today I'm going to be talking about Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which was a 47-page pamphlet released in 1776 that really spurred the American Revolution and turned it into what it became eventually.
All right, this sounds like a good argument. So, Jake, you're up first.
Well, I just think 9/11 is really, really important in the sense that, you know, media had changed throughout so much in the 20th century. And at the point in 2001, there was live coverage across all news platforms, and it was the first time America was really seeing something unfold in such a tragic, tragic sense. You know, you had Pearl Harbor that was, you know, nearing its 60th anniversary at the time of these attacks, and no one saw that live. No one saw their country being directly attacked at the time. So I think it's really, really important that we kind of look at this and, like, we see how an entire generation was desensitized by something like this and how it kind of set off a chain reaction of, you know, ages to come where stuff like tragedies and destruction and just loss of life doesn't affect them that much, and people just become, this is normal. Like, this is a normal thing because it was covered on such a grand scale.
Interesting that you make good points about how important the coverage of 9/11 was. However, my main issue with your argument is that I believe that the event is more important than the coverage itself. I believe that this piece of media I present is more important than any event that could have happened because this is what caused the event. Common Sense is truly what spurred the American Revolution. You see, it was released in 1776, as I say, it was released by Thomas Paine. He was a British tax collector, and he worked for the king, and then he learned that he hated him. Moved to Philadelphia, became good friends with James Franklin, and then he released this pamphlet, which essentially documented why the king sucked, why monarchy sucked, why America should be a beacon of liberty, and it is still, to this day, the highest-selling American novel in history. It sold 3 million, in a land of 3 million people, excuse me, it sold 500,000 copies, which today is the essential equivalent of selling 56 million copies in your first year on shelf. Now, not only did it kind of reprimand the idea of monarchy, not only did it bring that down, but it also gave the American politicians at the time, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, it gave them the idea of democracy in which we want today. So I don't believe there would be an America without this piece of media to begin with.
Well, you mentioned in the beginning that it was the direct cause for the American Revolution. I'm not denouncing the importance that it was a direct cause. However, to say that it's the single reason would be kind of incorrect. I would say the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and all those other acts that followed, and especially the, you know, the reparations, the repressions that were being put on the colonists at the time, I think also was a catalyst for the movement. But I'd say, like, you mentioned that 9/11, the event, was more important to itself. But how did the event, this is broadcasted live. This is unfolding for the first time. This was so new to people. It was a new type of war that was being presented to people at the time. And I think it really altered the chemistry of them. And I think, it's important to kind of notice that desensitization to such a tragic event because, you see these generations, especially our generation, Generation Z, that is able to just look past this stuff and just make it normal. And that's the media's fault. Not saying that it was unavoidable, but that is the media's, it's the direct cause of the media that caused us to feel that way.
That's a fair point. It is important that the media covered it so widely. However, I believe that that is just the current state of the world, and I don't think that the actual coverage of it is what caused the great pain, because we would have found out about it regardless. I think with this, and you say that the Stamp Act is what caused the revolution, that's what caused the beginning of the war. There wasn't going to be a revolution. At first, they just wanted to kind of spank the British and say, stop doing that. This is what caused the revolution to happen. This is what convinced the politicians it was okay to speak out about the ideas of revolution in general and form our modern day democracy, which, however imperfect it is, it's still what we currently live in, regardless of how good or bad it is. I don't think that the Stamp Act is what caused the people to be like, oh, we need to get out of Britain to begin with altogether. This is what caused that, in my opinion.
Well, I think for any kind of closing remarks I can give, I'd say that the final effect that the media coverage of 9/11 had on America itself was the fact that this was kind of the first time America was really united all together. As terrible as an event as it was, it brought everyone together, of course in tragic circumstances, but I give the media that credit.
It very much did.
And while these were both great arguments, I think I do agree with Brandon in that we're talking more about the thing itself rather than the media coverage of being impactful. So I think common sense is going to have to tell me that
Well
common
fought.
sense won.
You made very good points.
Fun, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
It's just common sense.
Winner be winner. Yeah, be Brandon. Oh, I'm so excited. Guys, I love
here.
this. All right.
Terrified.
I'm terrified too.
Great to see you.
Amazing to
I didn't see you
you.
standing
Good
across
luck.
the room there, so
All right. Do you guys just want to do a couple opening remarks and then get on in because you
I'll let
heard
you go
each
first,
other?
yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, ladies first. Love that. So, like I said, we have legislation that was passed, and one thing about me, I'm always going to be the advocate for policy. Policy is what shapes how we live. It's what shapes the society that we live in. And if it wasn't for this book being published, we, once again, would be eating diseased meat. We wouldn't have this level of government regulation. And I really think that that can even span to other areas. I mean, we have the FDA, we have the EPA, because now there's something that, there's this idea that the government should have oversight over certain industries. And before we didn't really have that. So that's how I'm going to open off of that. That's how I'm going to open my argument.
You make a fair point. I completely agree with you. However, I think that my argument still will remain in the fact that there would be no America without this, right? So the argument that we are trying to present today is what is the most influential in American history to begin with. And I don't think that there would be an American history without this argument, without this piece of media being released. However, I do completely agree with you that it is a very, very important piece of media that was released, because you are right, we would be eating nasty stuff. However, I don't agree that I throw stuff out when the label expires. I still don't do that. I don't know. That might just
That's
be
a little
me.
weird.
Maybe you're not.
Not right
common
away.
sense.
I mean, give me like
Maybe
a week.
you need some
Maybe you
common
need
sense.
it.
Maybe I
Thomas
do.
Paine.
Maybe I do. But I think that the important part about common sense, besides the fact that it spurred the American Revolution, is that it decided it wanted America to be a champion of liberty, which is what ultimately Americans want America to be. Unfortunately, that's not what we are. However, that is what the original goal was whenever this country started. So I think that when you have a pamphlet, when you have a book, when you have something like this, that not only freed America from Britain, got rid of the tyranny that the monarchy was presenting and destroying the country with and taking advantage of us with, and it also created the ideals for what America is to be, I don't think you can find anything more important in American history than that.
Do you have a response? Or all right,
I'm
you know
kind of
what?
stuck. I can't even lie to you.
Like,
I think Brandon
that's
makes
a great
amazing
argument.
points. So.
Yeah, both of you made amazing points. And I think that yes, the jungle definitely impacted American society. However, I do believe that common sense, it did have that start on American society, and I don't know if the jungle can beat that in the terms that we already set. While Brandon was the winner tonight because of common sense, impactful argument, we can all agree that society would not be what it is without all of these works. And I certainly don't know what pieces of media will come out or turn out to mold Americans next, but I cannot wait to find out. So back to you, Danny.
Thanks, Audrey. Stay tuned for our crime panel as they cover an infamous mob boss. We'll meet you back at the desk. are once again back at the desk. It's time to send it over to our next panel, the crime panel, to discuss the infamous Al Capone. Over to you, Eva.
Thanks, Danny. Al Capone was a legendary figure of American organized crime during the Roaring 1920s. Born and bred in Brooklyn, New York, this notorious gangster is known around the world, known as Scarface due to a prominent facial scar. Capone's reign over Chicago's underworld earned him a reputation as a shrewd and uncompromising mob boss. He dominated illegal bootlegging, speakeasies, and gambling operations. Despite his later downfall due to tax evasion, his legacy as a symbol of the glamorous yet grim reality of organized crime remains undiminished. Behold, the legendary Al Capone, a name that strikes fear into the hearts of all who cross him. Alrighty, so Sam, I'm going to throw it over to you. Would you like to kind of discuss his early life growing up?
I will. So, he was born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrants' parents. He had 8 other siblings, so it was a large family, and I want to note too, his siblings Ralph and Frank, those weren't their actual names, those were kind of cover names, helped him kind of like as a mob figure. He was a good student, but he had some troubles. He was expelled because he hit a female teacher, so that kind of shows some of his, harsh natures. I know we're going to cover later who he was influenced by. He was influenced by a bunch of different people, and he was married to his wife, May Josephine Capone, who had a son named Sonny. That was his cover name. And Sonny, as we know, has a large influence on the mob now, or back then. So that's a little bit about his prior life. He kind of moved all over, but that's where he started.
So kind of a public figure for Al Capone that I want to mention, kind of his mentor, was Johnny Torrio. And he ended up having a huge impact on Al Capone's life and kind of made him what he became. So Torrio was born in Naples, and he ended up going to New York City. And when he got there, he kind of became charge of a ton of brothels, and he was a saloon keeper. And he also became the leader of the James Street Boys gang. And then later it changed to the 5 Points gangs. And basically while he was there, he just kind of ran everything. That's also where he met Al Capone. He was then ushered away to Chicago, and he was part of the Big Jim Colosimo's gang. And while he was there, he was kind of doing a bunch of stuff, and he ended up being in charge of over 20 brothels. So he knew Al Capone from his time back in New York City, and he summoned Al Capone over to Chicago and kind of put him in charge of running one of the brothels. And basically, when he was there, he kind of just worked with Al Capone for a majority of his life. There's some controversy where he had either Al Capone or someone else murder someone for him because they were kind of, rivals. And he, even in 1925, ended up being shot at several times by a rival gang that he kind of was in competition with. And kind of after that, he decided to kind of retire. He moved back to Italy and lived out the rest of his life. However, he basically turned everything over to Al Capone that he had going in Chicago, which kind of gave Al Capone that huge platform to kind of jump off of. So he really just did it all for Al Capone. I mean, he literally was his mentor. He kind of taught him the ropes and kind of gave him all of that. He also ended up going to jail for a bit of time, like we'll see with Al Capone, for tax evasion. And basically he ended up dying of a heart attack down the line. But he had a huge influence in Capone's life, for sure.
Well, like you were saying with Johnny there, when Capone came to Chicago in 1920, really 1919, 1920, somewhere in that time frame, that's when he hit it big. That's when he became this huge figure that we all know today. It was sort of like when he went to Chicago, he started taking over these brothels and whatnot. Then all of a sudden you went into bootlegging, and prohibition was a huge thing at this point in time. They had just recently had a constitutional amendment that banned alcohol. And now all of a sudden with this idea of bootlegging and getting alcohol in illegally, this made Capone millions of dollars, and he became this huge figure that went from just this average little, gangster running around Chicago to this sort of icon of American gangster life, in a way, American mafioso gangster life. Capone went up, as far as he did because of this attention on him that came from bootlegging, and because he wanted to be a public figure. A lot of times that's what happened, is becoming a public figure as he did. This was what was interesting to him. He wanted to be famous. He wore flamboyant clothes and flamboyant suits, and fedoras to get people's attention. And that's why, mob figures before this were kind of considered shady characters. Nobody really wanted to be associated with a mob figure, but all of a sudden Capone shows up and it's, whoa, this guy he's a media mogul. He knows how to manipulate the press. He knows how to manipulate the police. He does all these different things to make himself into this figure we know today. But really what then became Capone's downfall was in 1929, an incident called the Valentine's Day Massacre, which, Eva, I think you have some more on that, which you can share.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I feel like a big thing I also kind of wanted to touch on first was just kind of like the kind of gang lifestyle with kind of getting caught. Like there's all so much shady stuff going on. And that's a huge reason that like so many of these mob leaders never ever got caught, or they got caught for different reasons because there was just so much shady stuff happening behind the scenes. And if you were part of these gangs, you kind of kept that to yourself and you kind of knew who you were out for, you knew what you were doing, and he was very smart like that. That's why no one ever witnessed his murders. And yeah, with the Valentine's Day Massacre, on Valentine's Day when he showed up with, correct me if I'm wrong, but with a gun and just massacred a bunch of people
he hired guys to do it. Yeah.
Hired people and just mass killed a bunch of people. It was insane. It was on Valentine's Day, and that's kind of how people kind of traced it back to him. Yeah. Yes, he wasn't there, he hired people, but people kind of in the back of their heads were like, I think this is tied to him. People started to kind of get shady with it. People kind of started to realize something weird's going on. So people kind of started to tie it back to him, which ultimately led to his downfall. However, they could not fully charge him for all of that because, you know, he wasn't at the scene.
And he was paying the police.
Yes, of course, he was bribing people off. But, you know, that's kind of where they were like, we need to charge this guy for something. He's so shady. So that's why they took the route of tax evasion and got him behind bars for, you know, towards the end of his life.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. One thing I wanted to notice, the photos that were up here before, they're very well dressed, you know, a lot of money individuals. So that's why he was able to, you know, a lot of people knew of him. He was well respected. So people were dressed as police uniforms. That's how he could get away with it. He went on so many cruises, so many vacations. And I want to talk about how he was caught. So he did not appear to a grand jury on March 12th. And he claimed he had bronchitis, he claimed he was sick, and he could not go. But the FBI was like, this is suspicious, so they traced back to him and obtained proof that he was at a horse race. He was, I believe, on a cruise to the Bahamas, so he was not sick during this time, which kind of showed that he didn't go for a reason. Then he was, you know, convicted of a ton of different charges. I don't have time to list all of them, but he only spent 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days in prison. And after he was released, he moved to Palm Island and he died of a stroke and pneumonia. He kind of just like left all that life behind. And it was actually known like that he had a mental IQ of a 12-year-old, which was crazy.
Yeah, I think overall, just kind of like to sum this all up, it's just crazy kind of like how everyone knows his name. Everyone knows the impact he had. I mean, they made movies about this. They made so many like celebrity things about Al Capone's life. And I feel like that just kind of goes to show the impact he had and like how well known he was to everyone.
Yeah, he was a huge figure for for a decade, basically from 1920 to 1929, 1930. He was the story to cover in the newspapers, whether that be in New York, especially in Chicago. But when the Great Depression happened, you know, kind of this public opinion turned on him because he was this rich, famous guy. Public opinion turned, so all of a sudden now you convict this rich guy for tax evasion. Okay, people are okay with it. Everybody kind of moves on with their lives.
Exactly. All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Al Capone's name still remains infamous and still holds great fear and power to this day. Back to you, Danny.
Thanks, Eva. Stay tuned for another flashback segment all about the Titanic. We'll be right back. We are back at the desk. It's now time to send it over to Eva Hines as she discusses one of the most infamous shipwrecks in history. Over to you, Eva.
Thanks, Danny. We all know the story of Jack and Rose and their undying commitment to each other. Does that ring a bell? No? My Heart Will Go On and the iconic pose on the bow of the ship. This is the story of the legendary passenger liner cargo ship, the Titanic, one of the most well-known shipwrecks in history. It's common knowledge how it sunk, but there is more to it. Monday marked the 112th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, so what way to better honor its legacy and those that died than to give it a whole segment? The Titanic was built back in March of 1909 in Belfast, Ireland. The ship was built by over 15,000 shipyard workers employed by the White Star Line. It was made to carry both cargo and passengers.
First-class passengers had access to luxuries such as a fitness center, smoking rooms, and a swimming pool, as well as other accommodations. However, lower-class passengers got much smaller rooms and limited accommodations. In total, the vessel could hold up to 2,435 passengers. It launched on May 31st, 1911, where it embarked on its first and only voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. Just 4 days after the departure, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank, resulting in the loss of approximately 1,500 lives. This is exactly where it sunk, and where Rose didn't give up any legroom and let Jack die. The construction of the ship's most crucial part, the hull, was made from steel plates up to 1 inch thick and steel rivets. However, despite this, according to some hypotheses, the Titanic was doomed from the start by a design that many lauded as state-of-the-art. The ship featured a double bottom and 15 watertight bulkhead compartments equipped with electric watertight doors that could be operated individually or simultaneously by a switch on the bridge. They were deemed practically unsinkable. However, the watertight compartment design contained a flaw that was a critical factor in the sinking of the Titanic. While the individual bulkheads were indeed watertight, the walls separating the bulkheads extended only a few feet above the waterline, so water could pour from one compartment into another, especially if the ship were to list or pitch forward. The second critical safety lapse that contributed to the loss of so many lives was the inadequate number of lifeboats. There were only 16 boats on board, so even if the lifeboats were loaded to full capacity during an evacuation, there were only available seats for 1/3 of those on board. There was widespread belief that the ship could not have possibly sunk, and due to unreliable means of communication at the time, in addition to miscommunication in newspapers, initially reported that the ship had collided with an iceberg but remained afloat and was being towed to a port with everyone on board. Now, efforts to locate the Titanic began soon after it sunk, but technical limitations as well as the vastness of the North Atlantic search area made finding it extremely difficult. Finally, in 1985, a joint U.S.-French expedition located the wreck of the Titanic. It was discovered 400 miles east of the Newfoundland and North Atlantic, some 13,000 feet below the surface. The wreck was in relatively good condition, with many objects on the ship still intact. However, now the wreck has been entirely overgrown with algae and deteriorating rapidly. Now, can we talk about how Rose didn't give Jack any room on that door? I mean, if I was in Rose's shoes, I would have totally scooched over and gave Jack some room, especially considering the whole "I'll love you forever" thing. Well, anyways, I should get back to gazing into the great Atlantic. Back to you, Danny.
Thank you, Eva. Sadly, that is all the time we have for today. In the meantime, stay updated with ATD on all our socials and let us know what you want to see us cover next. I'm Danny Vitale, and we will see you back at the desk next week.